Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Peter Riddle. I'm the Director of the Institute for Government, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to hear from Valerie Amos, the UN Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, and particularly glad to welcome her back to her old office. I think we've upgraded it a bit since your time, Valerie, and our private office was next door. And these vast cavernous offices, although you actually spent rather more time over at Westminster, so welcome back. I'm particularly glad because 7 months ago we had John Holmes launching his book on the politics of humanity here, and we talked very shortly after that. And so it's very good to have the succession here. And John went through a lot of his extremely hectic period doing the job you now perform and charging round. I think you can compare notes on air miles. But also what's interesting, and I think this will come out, is how whilst some of the countries you've dealt with are the same, what's interesting is how some are different, because new problems emerge in the period you've been doing your job. Now, the Institute, whilst our main focus is on British and domestic government, we're very keen not only to have an international perspective on problems of governance, but also to look in particular, as we showed at our earlier event with John, to look at the issues of governments which are faced with enormous humanitarian problems, often feel difficulty in dealing with those problems, and that changing environment. In fact, one of the senior researchers here has just come back from working for 6 months with the Sierra Leone government. She was on a secondment there, and will come back. She's coming back, I think, in a week or so. And I saw her recently bubbling with ideas, and no doubt will tell us how the UK government can improve based on that example. So we're very committed to pursuing events in this area. And of course, the demand for humanitarian assistance is rising. New problems, as I said, have emerged, particularly on your watch in Syria, where you've been, and the enormous difficulties on that, which we'll no doubt be talking about. And this trend is going to continue, not just because of disasters and civil wars, but also because of migration, urbanization, and the effects of climate change, very sharp rises in population. Also, the nature of international humanitarian response is changing, and that is a particular challenge which you faced in your work. So it's not just help with kind of search and rescue and aid delivery, but also training, expertise, shared support. These are core problems of governance. So that's the why we were particularly glad, and I was relieved when I got an email from you at about 11 last night saying I've landed. What I ought to have gone back and said where. I was slightly concerned it might be Beirut, not London, because when we selected this date a long time ago, who knows what the problems were going to be on it. So I'm very pleased you're here. Valerie's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. Then we'll open it up I'll ask some questions, and we'll open it up to discussion, and we'll have about an hour and a quarter. So, Valerie Amos.
Peter, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for welcoming me back to what indeed was my old office, and I had a fabulous view, as you could all see, but now is the home of the Institute for Government. And I'm particularly pleased that we chose this date now, although at the time it seemed to be such a long time ago, because recent world events, I think, have really put the United Nations and some of the work we do right back at the center of the agenda. And I often get very frustrated because in the humanitarian work that we do, we are in so many different places, not just Syria, places that people have almost forgotten about: Yemen, the Central African Republic. There are still crises going on in Sudan and South Sudan, and John, my predecessor, knows about those very well. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, Afghanistan, Myanmar, the list goes on. And sometimes I get hugely frustrated because there's a sort of public narrative, which is that the UN is not doing very much, and we have people who are engaged in humanitarian activity, peacekeeping and everything else, day in, day out, and that's not necessarily recognized. Tonight, what I really want to do is to particularly focus on my own area of work, humanitarian affairs, in the context of the wider United Nations role and how our response as an international community at some key moments in the recent past has determined where we are today and has shaped the understanding of the role of what I will loosely call humanitarianism and the role that humanitarian work should play in addressing the challenges caused by conflict and natural disasters around the world. When pressed to define what we do and differentiate it from development aid, we in the humanitarian world talk about humanitarian work being life-saving, about its core principles, neutrality, independence, humanity, impartiality, about its universal applicability, everyone has the right to help if they're in need. But how those principles can be applied in situations of ever-increasing complexity, in war zones, in a world with 24/7 media, where millions of people have a mobile phone, where the internet has given us access to swathes of unfiltered information, where comment is free, where millions of people engage directly across continents and cultures and leave their governments behind, where power relations between countries are constantly shifting, but where the governance systems of key global institutions remain the same, and where belief can be more important than fact, is challenging us all. I use the word challenging deliberately because for me and for many others, it is challenging. But for many people, it's not challenging at all, but overwhelming. And they're looking to their leaders for vision, for answers, for stability, for a way to understand the complexity, indeed the connectivity, the fragmentation in our world, a way to see the opportunities presented by globalization and by change. And many are disappointed or confused because they don't necessarily see the leadership that they are looking for being exercised. Now, one of the reasons that I remain passionate about the role that the United Nations can play in this changing world goes back to the founding principles of the United Nations. The clear recognition of the importance of the people of the world. We often forget that the preamble to the United Nations Charter starts with the words, "We, the peoples in the United Nations," and goes on to give firm commitments to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, reaffirms faith in fundamental human rights, and refers to the importance of tolerance in the world. All key principles that are as important today as they were then. It's an organization that was born out of the horrors of the Second World War and the determination of our leaders at that time to prevent further conflict. And we've seen significant progress despite our ongoing collective despair at our failure to act more decisively and effectively in, for example, Rwanda and Bosnia. Landmines are now considered inhumane and indiscriminate means of war. 161 states have signed up to the 1997 Mine Ban Treaty. 18 armed groups have agreed plans to end the use of children in armed conflict, in line with UN General Assembly resolutions. 2 years ago, for the first time, senior military officers from the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo were given lengthy prison sentences for offences, including sexual violence in conflict. Human rights is very much on the agenda, and at the ICC, Charles Taylor has become the first former head of state to be convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we've seen the development of the concept of responsibility to protect, which focuses on the responsibility of all states to protect people at risk, rather than on the moral or legal right of outsiders to intervene in states. But despite these developments, and I don't think that we remember them often enough, there continues to be debate and discussion about when is it right to intervene in the affairs of a state on humanitarian grounds, regardless of whether or not this infringes on state authority. We live in a world in which the rule of law, justice, and rights have a fundamental and important underpinning. For without it, intervention appears arbitrary, but the moral dilemmas remain. Can we just stand by and watch people suffer? How loud should we shout in terms of our public advocacy? What are the limits to that advocacy and the right balance with private diplomacy? And that's a challenge that we face practically every day. And we're always told in my job, and I think John will remember it as well, that we haven't actually quite got it right. There are always those who think we should shout louder, and there are always those who say we should do more private diplomacy. And as humanitarian workers, are we colluding when we know that there are atrocities, can't prove them, and stay to try to help? There's no end to the questions and no easy answers, because as the world evolves, as power shifts, we see different things happening. States seeking to exert greater authority and effectiveness in their own response to crises. States using sovereignty as a reason to prevent humanitarian access to places they don't want the international community to go, or indeed for us to see things they don't want us to see. I remember in one major crisis recently, what it showed up were the high levels, incredibly high levels of malnutrition in the children in certain states in that country, which the world had no idea about until we went there as part of the humanitarian response. And we see states growing stronger in terms of their legitimacy and authority, wanting recognition and respect for that progress and partnership in the way that they move forward. So how do we deal with these dilemmas? First, I think we need to put the people, and in particular women and children, at the centre of our response. Listen to what they tell us about what they need. That means reforming the way that we do our business. Humanitarian needs are growing. At the end of last year, I launched an appeal for nearly $5 billion for this year to help people, 56 million people across the world. That's not everyone in our world that faces humanitarian need. Those are the ones that we assessed at that time in most need. So how do we reform the way we do our business? Well, technology is helping us to do it. Emerging trends like digital mapping, social media, and of course greater access to mobile phones means instant communication with a lot of people. In 105 countries in the world, there are now more mobile phones than there are people. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't continue to have communication challenges, particularly in some of the most remote areas in our world, but it does mean that people can tell us where they are, what they're short of, what they need, and they can give us instant feedback as well. Not always complimentary, but always useful to help us refine what we're doing. I remember a member of my staff going to the Philippines, to a community that had suffered from flooding, and she sat down and spoke to the women in that community. Nobody had done it until that point, and she talked to them about what they needed, and they said, well, you know, people came in and they brought food and they brought all these up. They said, we don't need any of those things. They said, that bridge that was washed away as a result of the flood, if you fix it, we can go and get the things that we need. The humanitarian community had been there for some time. We were so focused on the help that we could bring rather than the help that was needed, we had gone into overdrive. Second, we have to recognize not only that the world has changed, but also look practically at how we can grow a truly global, diverse, and more inclusive humanitarian system. Yes, the principles which underpin our work, and I've mentioned them already, neutrality, impartiality, independence, humanity, they date back 150 years. And we're very, very proud of that tradition. Those principles have stopped a lot of humanitarian workers being killed. But as humanitarian needs grow across the world, For example, in 1977, the number of people in the world internally displaced by armed conflict stood at 70 million. At the end of 2011, it was 26.4 million. And as different and more diverse organizations become an integral part of the humanitarian response system, military actors, the private sector, more and more civil society groups, we need to ensure that we believe in the same things. We may all want the same outcome, but have different ways of getting there. So how do we build the partnerships that will lead to a greater buy-in to those principles? And indeed, how do we have the arguments about what those principles mean in different countries and different situations? And particularly in conflict situations, how do we ensure that we do no harm and make the situation worse by mixing humanitarian and political messages and responses? Really hard to do when we know that everything is connected. Third, how can the commitments that we espouse to preparedness and capacity building of communities and governments, both local and national, and to regional organizations, become a truly integral part of the agenda? We know it works. Governments want to lead humanitarian efforts in their own countries. Countries like Brazil and Turkey have themselves become major donors. Countries want greater investment in training, expertise, and support for early warning systems. Bangladesh suffered similar cyclones 16 years apart. In the first one, 150,000 people died. In the second, 4,000. The 2010 earthquake in Haiti killed hundreds of thousands of people, not just because of its magnitude, but because people were living crowded together in poorly constructed buildings that pancaked when their foundations moved. A similar earthquake in San Francisco in 1989 killed 63 people. Preparedness works. Every dollar spent on reducing risks can save 6 in disaster response further down the line. And the human cost, which can be devastating, can be cut substantially. Fourth, how do we make stronger linkages between different areas of work? As I said at the beginning, humanitarian work is life-saving, but chronic long-term emergencies are the result of a number of factors. For example, the impact of insecurity, political fragility, conflict, environmental degradation, chronic poverty, poor infrastructure, corruption. And there's population growth. We don't like to talk about it, but the population of the countries where most humanitarian action takes place is projected to nearly double between 1990 and 2025. Yemen's population growth is 2.3% in a country where half of its people are already in need of humanitarian aid, and 150,000 children under 5 are at risk of death due to acute malnutrition. In Niger, population growth stands at 3.8%. More than half of Niger's people are poor. 34% are extremely poor. And I remember sitting down and talking to authorities about this, and they now actually have a minister for population in Niger. Every woman on average has 7 children, but in a country where they're already having difficulty feeding the people that they have. We can't address this scale of crisis year on year through humanitarian response alone. Crisis is becoming the new normal in some countries, which is why I welcome what is called the New Deal on fragile states, focusing on a more joined-up response across the humanitarian and development communities. There is far too much compartmentalization. We need to work closely with our partners in development to build longer-term sustainability. But we're also seeing global trends which pose a threat to the foundations and relevance of our humanitarian work. The legal and normative basis for our work is international conventions dating back more than 100 years, including the Geneva Conventions and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But applying these conventions implies that states take greater responsibility for implementation. But that is not always the case. There are dozens of examples of repeated denials of access in defiance of international humanitarian law, particularly in times of war. And of course, we know why. Conflict has its own logic. It has its own dynamic. Both sides want to win. In fact, sometimes there are multiple sides. They all think that they can win at all costs. If non-state armed groups are prepared to violate humanitarian and human rights law, for example, by using deadly force against civilians, you can be sure that they're prepared to deny those same civilians access to humanitarian aid. And governments do the same thing as well, sometimes in the name of national sovereignty. And that brings me to Syria, the crisis which is at the top of my agenda right now. A conflict with four major dimensions. The one which has had all of the international attention and major focus in the last few weeks, which is the use of chemical weapons in the recent Security Council resolution on chemical weapons. But there's a political dimension as well. There's a human rights dimension. Of course, there is a major humanitarian dimension. This is a regional, not a Syria crisis now. Inside the country, almost everyone is affected by the depreciation of the currency. It's lost about 80% of its value, the destruction of the infrastructure, water and electricity supplies damaged, health and education facilities destroyed or damaged, and a brutality being meted out day by day, which is almost unimaginable and very, very difficult to listen to when I talk to people who have suffered it. But it's the reality of people's daily lives. 6.8 million people in the country, that's a third of the population, are in urgent need of help. 4.2 million of them, two-thirds of them, are displaced in their own country and have had to leave their homes and communities, many of them several times. 2 million people have left and are registered as refugees in neighboring countries, in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Iraq. But many more than that have fled. 1/5 of the population of Lebanon is now made up of Syrians. And if you want to know what that means, that would be the United Kingdom having to absorb another 20% of people. That's around 12 million people. So we say to those neighbouring countries, please do keep your borders open. Make sure that the refugee conventions are applied. And they do. And we say we will support and help. But the domestic impact of that is huge. Looking at this from the outside, people constantly say to me, we don't know whose side to be on, because the atrocities are being committed by all sides. Siege is being used as a weapon of war. Areas in government control which we can't reach, because they say that communities in those areas are opposition groups, they're fighters, they don't want us to reach them. Areas in opposition control, which we can't reach because they say that the people in those areas are supporting the government. Despite all of that and huge insecurity, we are making enormous efforts. We've reached more than 2.5 million people with food aid. We're chlorinating water so that 10 million people can now get clean water. They can drink it. There are mobile health clinics. But we estimate that there are 2 million people in besieged areas we have not been able to reach. And there are terrible stories of those people running out of food, of people being injured who are not able or allowed to leave. I very much hope that the consensus statement, which was agreed by the Security Council, the first such statement on humanitarian action inside Syria, which was agreed about 10 days ago, will help us to make progress on this. But our work in Syria is painstaking and it's heartbreaking. Let me give you one example. If we want to send convoys of food or health supplies or anything else from Damascus to Aleppo, we have to go through an average of 50 checkpoints, Half of them may be controlled by the government, and with the right paperwork signed off in Damascus, we can get through those. The other half are controlled by different opposition groups. So our teams on the ground have to negotiate their way through every single one of those convoys and those checkpoints. And they don't know who they're going to have to negotiate with. It can take them up to 4 days in an incredibly insecure and volatile environment. So I really hope that the political talks will make progress, because this is a situation that needs a political solution. The estimated damage that has already been caused inside Syria will take at least 10 years to repair once the conflict stops. And we have no way of estimating what the impact of the trauma that the people have gone through will be. We have lost, in my view, a generation of Syria's children. This is a crisis that is taking on an increasingly sectarian character, with communities turning on communities. I don't think that any one of us, is that a cough telling me that I've talked too long?
No,
oh, right.
The cough is a cough.
I said to Peter, tell me when I've gone on too long. I don't think that any one of us has an answer to these dilemmas. And that's why I come back to the beginning. That's why we need the United Nations. Precisely because it's a place for discussion and debate. The place where we do prevention, where we do peacekeeping, peace building, preventive diplomacy. The place where we see human rights as an essential component of human protection. The drafting committee of the United Nations Charter underscored that if fundamental freedoms or rights are, and I quote, grievously outraged, so as to create conditions which threaten peace or obstruct the application of the Charter, then they cease to be the sole concern of each state. We're still wrestling with that and what it means in reality. It's not a good problem to have, but it is essential that we continue our work on this. 193 member states, each with multiple perspectives in a world with creeping vulnerabilities, water scarcity, transnational crime, climate change, to add to everything else that we know about, rapid urbanization, more issues that we can't address alone. If it was easy, we wouldn't have needed to set up the United Nations in the first place. Now that we have it, we know that we have to reform, we have to be innovative, we have to challenge ourselves, we have to be agents of change. I'm very much a part of that in the work that I do on the humanitarian side, and we look for the help and support of our member states, including the United Kingdom, to help us to take that vision further. Thank you very much.
Valerie, that was absolutely fascinating. I mean, so many issues in that, in so many ways. And your description of the problems in Syria, I mean, as you say, the strains and stresses. Could there's one practical thing, and it was also raised by John some months ago. You mentioned the number of displaced people, then the number of refugees. Does it make sense any longer to have a separate Commissioner for Refugees as opposed to your job?
Ooh.
I mean, given that, if you're in Jordan or you're in Syria or Lebanon.
I do think that there is a real issue, which is that you have different overlapping organizations with overlapping mandates, which undoubtedly creates issues in terms of actual practice on the ground. And I do think that this is something that needs to be looked at. I mean, we spend a lot of time trying to work out how do we coordinate more effectively, how do we bring all of these different organizations together. And they are essentially, they're almost big businesses in their own right. But But I think it needs more than just do we need all of these different organizations. I think we have to almost turn the issue inside out and say, given the way the world has changed, given that if we put people at the center of this change, if we're going to use innovation and new technology more effectively, how can we, and people hate it when I use a sort of business model, because this is about people and it's about humanitarian issues, but how can we effectively come up with a different model? I mean, I think that we should be, every single day, we should be trying to put ourselves out of business. But actually, every single day, we're growing. So I don't think it necessarily makes sense, but it's not, does it make sense to have a different refugee agency and a different coordination agency? I think it's about looking at the sector overall. It's not just about the different component parts of it.
Now, one of the other things that came through was, well, what's is, of course, different types of humanitarian disaster. I mean, you mentioned the floods and earthquakes and natural disasters where you can actually take prevention. But how much, when you're talking about failures of government, civil war, there you're inevitably a lagging agency, aren't you? That you can only respond, and you're virtually always frustrated by governments who deny there's a problem.
Well, it's not just that. I think the thing that is most difficult is the combination of all of those things. So, because so many of these crises are happening in places of fragility, so you will have a conflict, and it's not, and I probably didn't say this sufficiently clearly in my speech, but a lot of conflict now is not between countries, it's within countries, and it may be about all sorts of things. So you will have a country which will suffer from natural disasters of some form or other. It may be, let me take a country like Mali. Mali, weak government, had a coup immediately after a year in which they had had a major drought, so high levels of malnutrition, weapons flowing into the country from Libya, and at one stage, across countries of West and Central Africa, we were battling against the food security situation becoming one which led to famine. It did not, and there was a lot of preventive work that helped in relation to that. But you're not just dealing with, we weren't just dealing with conflict. We weren't dealing with a state that was particularly difficult. We were dealing with a very fragile state, and at one stage, a state that didn't exist at all because there had been effectively a coup. So what is harder and harder for us is that you're not dealing with one thing or the other. If we were just dealing with, for example, a major natural disaster, if you look at a country like Japan, and I remember this very clearly, I had been in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and I landed in Brussels, and the reason I remember this is because it was so close to my birthday, which sounds pathetic, but it was 2 days before my birthday. I landed from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where it's always very hard in the Democratic Republic of the Congo because you meet people who have suffered year after year after year, and you feel as if we've put in all this money and there's been a huge amount of collective action and everything else, and you go and talk to people in the communities and you think, well, what have we managed to change? So I wasn't feeling particularly upbeat, and I talked to a lot of women who had suffered sexual violence and so on. And I land in Brussels, and on the screen is Japan unfolding. And I just look at the screen, and I think all I've done is fly overnight, and this has happened. And you get a triple crisis in Japan, in probably the best prepared country in the world. Yet look at the impact that had. And of course it was managed extremely well. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that you have we're having more and more crises in countries that are extremely fragile and vulnerable. And if you look at the difficulty that even well-prepared countries have if they have a major natural disaster, and what we're dealing with is Yemen, a political process that where they're trying to bring different political parties together, chronic vulnerability and under development, huge insecurity, a country which is used as for migratory flows, lots of migrants from Ethiopia crossing Yemen trying to get into Saudi Arabia. I mean, any country trying to deal with that range of issues would have difficulty. A country that has so many layers of fragility finds it difficult. And I don't think that, I mean, we talk about Yemen as a humanitarian crisis. It's essentially a country that's facing such chronic vulnerability that it tips over into crisis because those underpinnings have not been dealt with.
What can you do on some of the underpinnings of governance? Because your mission is quite clear, to keep people alive, basically, and then as well as preventative work when we're talking about environmental disaster. How much can you actually help with governance?
Well, this is where I think the connectedness comes in. That this agenda is not just about a humanitarian agenda, although I think there are things that we can do around governance on the humanitarian side, because part of what we do is to help to build the capacity of communities and help to build the capacity of local authorities and governments and everything else. And you help them to do that in a transparent and accountable way. And the way that we do our work, demonstrating the need for accountability in our work is also, I think, a key part of developing that governance. So you will have non-state armed actors in countries that will say to us, bring the supplies and just drop them here and we'll deliver them. And we say we can't do that. We are accountable to the countries and the donors that give the money. They have a public that they have to be accountable to. And we need to be able to say to them that we have met the needs of X, Y, and Z. Of course, there is quite often, particularly in a war zone, there are a lot of issues about, money's gone missing or supplies have gone missing. It is tiny in comparison with what we actually manage to get to the people who need the help. And I have to say that I'm very challenging on this, because I know that in many countries where donors are extremely generous, you get these kind of lurid stories in the newspapers about, money has gone into the hands of, or supplies have gone into the hands of, X-armed group or whatever. It's less than, if we look at our figures, if we look at the kind of risks that we build into our programs, this is often less than 1%. And I think that there needs to be more credit given to the people on the ground who are actually going through and working in incredibly insecure environments. Just in Syria, we as the UN have lost 11 people. The Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which is the local organization that does a lot of this delivery, they've lost 30 people since this crisis started. People forget about the environments in which they work. I went to Sudan and went to visit a part of Sudan, Jonglei state, which is impossible to get to when the rains are on. It's pretty impossible to get to when the rains aren't on. I mean, the infrastructure is terrible. I went there because there had been a kind of local ethnic conflict. We had staff working there the conditions in which they were working, and working day in, day out in a really kind of positive way. I always feel so proud, and their stories don't get told.
What about, you emphasise independence, and you also emphasise the fact that the new media enables you to deal directly with, your point on mobile phones, that you talked about that village and saying, well, get the bridge right and we don't need the thing. How does that affect the response of the governments, however fragile they may be, to working with you, if they see you working directly with communities and so on?
Well, first of all, you can't just go in and work directly with the community. I mean, it's very clear under the mandate in which we work that you have to essentially get the permission of the government. And there was an attempt to make a sort of huge negative story out of this in relation, for example, to the work that we do in Syria. Because we do an assessment, we talk to the government about it. I remember the first time I went, which was about 18 months ago, the government said to me that there was not a humanitarian crisis inside Syria. We got to a point where they accepted it, where we did a joint assessment, but where we made certain things very clear, that if there were places the government couldn't go to, we would still go, if we saw need, we would bring supplies to help people and so on. And so we did a joint assessment, and we came up with a plan, which was painstakingly, I have to say, negotiated with the government. That was seen as a sort of failure of the United Nations because we continued to work with the government. It's very clear in the mandate that drives our work that we have to work with the recognized government of that country. So you can't just go directly and work with X or Y. What you tend to do is have some kind of broad memorandum of understanding or something of that sort and work under that umbrella.
How does duty to protect come into that?
How does?
Duty to protect. I mean, after all, there's a new doctrine. How can that could that influence that in a different way?
Well, it's the responsibility to keep our staff safe, of course, rests with us, but it rests first and foremost with the state in which they are working. And that has implications as well, because of course a state will say to us, we don't want you to go there because it's dangerous and we can't keep you safe, which is another way of not being able to go to the places that you need to go to.
Before I open it up, are there lots of places where you would like to work but you can't for the constraints you've described?
There are lots of places where we may be working and would like to get into more of those places where we are working, or where we would like. It's an odd dilemma. If you're a country and you're a government of that country, you want your people to feel confident in your abilities as a government. Yeah. So you don't want to admit necessarily that you have a crisis that you yourself cannot manage or control. And that does not necessarily mean that it's a government or a state that doesn't care, but they're weighing up domestic considerations against the whole range of other things. So sovereignty is used in all kinds of different ways. It can be used to prevent, it can be used because it's about recognition and respect for who we are, and that we have these abilities, and actually we want our people to feel that we're doing a good job. So I think it's much less about there are countries that we're just not even allowed to work in, and much more about once you get there, can you do the negotiations that enable you to actually do your job as effectively as you should?
Right, let's open it up. There's a roving mic around, and could you say who you are now? Yeah. Public now.
Yeah, David Neat, lawyer and poet.
Sorry,
Thank
I
you.
didn't hear where you're from.
I'm from London here, via Jamaica. Thank you for your well-delivered speech, Baroness. You gave a profound example of the approach or the worldview of an organization as opposed to the wisdom of the people when you talked about wanting to provide food when a bridge would have done the job. And that's on a micro level. And I just wonder if sometimes you feel on the macro level that sometimes strategically organizations take that same approach in that they have an approach to helping out, which is short-termist or coming from their own worldview without consultation of the people, but maybe a better strategy could be developed that build bridges like the bridge you were talking about. Because it seems to me that in some of the places we're talking about, one of the key issues is that there's no freedom of movement. And in other places that survive fairly better, people are free to move. If you look at the West, and some people are free to move, and that brings about, mobility. But even within Africa, there is limited freedom of movement, even between countries. And I know that's probably not an area, a remit that you can deal with. However, did that experience, or does that experience inform the way you guys think about a global strategy or your overall strategy so that it's more effective?
Just so I understand properly, when you say freedom of movement, do you mean in terms of borders and immigration policy and customs and so on?
Yeah, that's what kind of perspective.
So you've got a European Union, but you don't necessarily have the same thing in ECOWAS in West Africa and so on. I think if you look at the, and I talk about connectedness, and I know I've spoken about connectedness a lot, but I think if you look at the fact that we are talking about parts of the world which really require high levels of economic development, where you can't take an undifferentiated approach. I mean, there are countries on the African continent where the growth rates, for example, are extremely high, and others where it's not, but where you'll see transportation routes, which means that, to get from one side of the continent to the other, it's actually quicker to go through Europe or go down, if you're in West Africa, it may be quicker to go down to South Africa and then go back up to the east. So yes, I think that there are some big issues around freedom of movement, freedom of trade, freedom of goods, how people relate to each other, which is part of the broader global agenda. And of course, it has a profound impact on some of what we do, because if you're trying to move stuff across borders, you have to get customs clearances, you have to negotiate in very particular kinds of ways which may delay our work. But I think it's a much broader strategic geopolitical issue, in as much as it's also a personal issue for people. I mean, the rise in people trafficking across the world. I mean, I mentioned Yemen and migratory flows. I mean, much of it is due to people trafficking. So families in Ethiopia will gather all of their money to try to get one member of that family into Saudi Arabia, as an example. And there's a tortuous route that the traffickers will take, which ends with the person ending up in Yemen trying to get across the border into Saudi Arabia. They get turned back. They end up in Yemen, an already fragile country with absolutely nothing, with no ways of returning, and very often no paperwork either. So, yes, there are connections in all of these things which need to be addressed. And it may be that greater freedom of movement of people in search of work, kind of economic migration, might be bolstered and supported. But we all know how difficult that is, because countries worry about migratory flows if they are successful and if they have greater economic development.
John.
It's always a test to be asked a question by your predecessor.
I know. I'm not going to be too difficult, Valerie. John Holmes, I was Valerie's successor, predecessor, as Peter said, not successor. Just to go back to Syria, I mean, one sort of broad point and one more specific point. Obviously, you've asked for huge amounts of money for Syria, and the response has not been particularly good. And I'd be interested in why you think that is. I mean, I'm not talking about the British government so much, but internationally, the response has not been what one might have expected, given that the international community can't do much else at the moment. But the second question: how much of money could be spent if we had better access. In other words, is access just as big a problem as money, or even maybe an even bigger problem than money? I've been seeing your comments on that too. And the more specific point is whether you should need Security Council approval to go cross-border into rebel-held areas or not, or whether we should just do it even if the government or the Russians or whoever doesn't agree with that. I mean, it's a more specific point, but I think it's quite an important one for getting into non-government held areas.
To start with the money, we started the year, in January of this year, we said that we needed about $1.5 billion to work in Syria and neighboring countries. So people inside and also refugees. And that was our estimate for 6 months. And in fact, we were successful in raising that money. We had a major pledging conference in Kuwait, and we raised the bulk of that money. By mid-year, we had revised our figures, and and they had gone up so much, we were basically asking for an additional $3 billion, which in humanitarian terms is a lot of money. It's not if you look at all kinds of other global spending, but in humanitarian terms, I think it is. And all this at a time when I feel the complexity of the crisis was becoming greater. So what you were seeing were, greater fragmentation of these opposition groups. I think people on the outside looking in and thinking, well, whose side are we supposed to be on? And also when you were seeing greater and greater brutality. So I think that fed into a public consciousness, and I continue to feel very strongly that people feel we're on the side of the people, but then we don't know who is supposed to govern those people. And I think that has a big impact on the spending, because I think people see the brutality, but they just say this is being meted out by both sides. It doesn't matter whether it's equal or not. Then the Syria crisis is highly politicized. I mean, you have countries that came out very early, said basically that Assad is illegitimate, that he has to go, and so on and so forth. So you ended up with a highly politicized environment. You have countries in the Gulf which have been very, very clear about supporting the opposition. You have a Turkish government that has been very forceful in supporting the opposition. And then you have a Security Council that's been divided. So I think all of that has fed into this. And some countries have been extremely generous. The United Kingdom, the United States, for example, the European Union, many of the Nordic countries have given substantially. A lot of the Gulf countries have given substantially. Kuwait has given substantially to the United Nations appeal. Many other countries in the Gulf have given substantially, but directly either to the Syrian National Coalition or to the coordination unit, which is a sort of humanitarian arm of the opposition. And there is a kind of view that there's a mix of arms being brought in as well as humanitarian supplies being. So I think there is that complexity as well. So if you actually put together all of the money that has been spent, what we call bilaterally, state to state, or directly to opposition groups, plus the money through the multilateral system, I think you'll actually find that a lot of money has been spent. The difficulty for me is that I think that it has not been as coordinated as well as it should, because it's coming in through all of those different channels. And on your question about, cross-border, which has been a huge debate amongst member states. I remind everybody that Syria is a country that has several borders. The border that the Syrian government has difficulty with is the Turkish border. We are bringing in goods every day from Lebanon. That's the border that I use in my in the visits that I have made more recently. Obviously, when I was going last year, I was flying directly into Damascus, but that is not now possible to do. The border with Jordan, we used to bring things across that border on a regular basis, but the security situation on that border is now much more difficult because it is reported that one of those border points is now controlled by al-Nusra. So it is one particular border where there is an issue, and that's because the Syrians view that border. They have a difficult relationship with the Turks. They view that border as the border where the supplies are being brought in to arm the opposition. So I always say let's be more careful when we're talking about this issue of cross-border operations, because we're talking about one specific border. There are a number of organizations which are operating across that border already. I think that there are, the recent statement agreed by the Security Council talked about looking at the most appropriate and effective means of getting aid in, including through cross-border operations. And I think we just have to keep looking at what's the most effective way of doing our job. So some of it is about crossing conflict lines. Some of it is looking at how can we get more in across the borders that we are currently using. Was there a third question that I missed? It's the balance between money and access. It's both. I mean, there's no doubt that there are parts of Syria, because of what I described as this use of siege as a weapon of war. I mean, there are areas in rural Damascus, so it's not that far from the center of Damascus, where we've been prevented from going for months. There are areas in Aleppo in opposition control where we have not been able to get to. I remember last year when on my first visit to Syria, I went to a neighborhood in Homs called Baba Amma. We were the first people to get in after effectively a war that had waged in that neighborhood for over a month. I mean, literally the last tank was rolling out as we were allowed in. So this is happening in communities, town. This is a very urban conflict, and I keep trying to say to people, you've got to understand that it's not like Libya, where you had the east of the country that was in the control of the opposition groups, and you had the rest. It's all mixed up. You have neighborhoods, you have communities, and it ranges from armed groups, a little local militia, Al-Qaeda affiliated groups, the Syrian National Coalition, the government. It's very mixed and very difficult, which is what makes the security even more difficult.
In the back.
Martin Benedict from the Associated Press. Could I ask you about Syria? Could you tell us what you would like to see right now from the UN Security Council and from the international community generally to help you with your humanitarian work in Syria? And kind of separately, but kind of connected, what is the single most important thing that would help you in that regard?
The single most important thing would be a political solution, actually. The single most important thing would be agreement on what the different parties would do next that would bring about a ceasefire, a degree of stability, and some kind of return to sufficient stability in the country that would enable people to kind of return and begin to rebuild their lives. That's the single most, it's not the most important thing is not actually a humanitarian thing, it's a political thing.
Could I ask you about the international community and the UN Security Council?
Well, we just got a presidential statement from the Security Council. I would have preferred a resolution because it's binding. We were not able to do that, but we got a presidential statement which is quite detailed in terms of the countries of the Security Council, denouncing the violence, calling for cessation, calling for health facilities and health workers to be protected, detailing a set of practical measures. So if we can implement that, it would go a very long way to helping our our work on the ground in Syria and also in neighbouring countries. So if I get the support of the Security Council to really put that into place, it would make a big difference.
Sure. Both here.
Oh, Sue, I haven't seen you for years. There's so many people in here that...
Sue Street, former civil servant, and thank you. It was a fascinating exposition. I wondered if I might be able to tempt you to comment on this government's position in all of this. But you might choose. But you know, on the one hand, Prime Minister's been very clear about protecting the overseas aid budget. On the other hand, the government fulminates, sometimes understandably, in my view, on some of the way that human rights judgments are affected. So it's complicated. And linked to that, I wondered whether it might depoliticise your work a bit if you were much kind of clearer about the humanitarian objectives, which everybody shares. I mean, nobody can be against helping people stay alive. But when it's founded so philosophically on human rights, which very powerfully expounded by you, it sort of politicises everything, because no country is going to feel that it wants you to be commenting on whether their citizens have their human rights protected, even though they might well agree that they need food or water, medical care or infrastructure solutions.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that the humanitarian and human rights arms of the United Nations are different. You know, so there is an office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights who does all of that reporting and everything else. We don't do that. But at the same time, you cannot ignore human rights violations in humanitarian crises. I mean, I cannot ignore the fact that I have humanitarian crises in places in conflict, partly because of a denial of rights, because a government or opposition uses siege as a weapon of war. I mean, it creates a humanitarian crisis. It's not something, I haven't created it, it's been created on the ground. So I think the idea of saying that there is, yes, it would be great to say that there is pure humanitarianism, whatever that is, meaning that everybody has the right to help. But everybody has the right to help in a context, in an environment. And that environment is the country or the community or whatever it is that they are operating in, which is what brings the challenge in terms of the job. So I think it's very hard to separate out in the way that's what the principles are there to help us to do. But I know if I go into, let me give an example. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, it has a UN peacekeeping mission which has a mandate to protect civilians in a country that is the size of Western Europe with about 10,000 troops. I mean, who have other jobs. I mean, their job is peacekeeping, and humanitarian protection is protection of civilians is an element of that. So when I go to North Kivu, which is probably the size of France or something, and women say that they are chased by armed groups in a densely forested part of the country when they try and go to do something in their fields or to draw water. You can understand why, members of the peacekeeping mission are not there to keep them safe. So you have a country like the DRC, which has a UN peacekeeping mission. We try to do development, rule of law, strengthening the justice institutions. I mean, this is a country where, as I said in my speech, members of the armed forces, year on year, people are saying, we were raped by the armed forces. It's not just the armed groups. And where recently you did have these prosecutions and people were found guilty. where we have had people living in camps or a humanitarian operation since peace was declared in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So you have all these different arms of the United Nations. And if you are sitting as a citizen of the DRC receiving all of this aid, or if you want to make mischief as an armed group, you don't say, oh, those humanitarian, we try to say we're working in an independent, Peter picked up on my point about independence. We try to say, look, we are working for the people. We're not getting involved in the political agenda. We're not getting involved in all of these other things. That's not how people necessarily experience it or see it. On the role of the British government, and this is in a way difficult. I'm an international civil servant now, but it's difficult because I used to be a former development minister. And as a former development minister, I feel really proud of Britain's record on development. And I feel really proud of that continuing commitment to development. And I feel particularly proud of it because in a country that is going through a difficult economic time, it gets questioned all the time. And it's one of those issues which certainly I think over time has become, a sort of cross-party issue in the United Kingdom. And I think it's really important. I think it's important that it is. And I think that recognition and commitment to development, to the people in the world that have much less than we do, and and which really links into a whole history of what started as a philanthropic tradition in the United Kingdom. I think it's something that we should be incredibly proud of. But it's hard for me to say because I'm British in an international institution, so I'm not there to fly the British flag. But it is something I'm proud of.
Barry, just finally, before I wind up.
You shouldn't probably ask the last question.
Oh, yeah. I'm going to anyway. One of the things which is striking is, obviously, Syria takes up a vast amount of your time, yet there are a very large number of humanitarian problems around the world. I mean, obviously, there's a donor problem there of ones which are kind of, I hate to say ticking over, but ones which are endemic problems, where it's prevention and so on. How do you get that balance? Because all the energy can be sucked in. I mean, like I remember John talking in his book about what was happening in Sri Lanka and various other places which had really demanding for a period and so on. I mean, Syria is on a much bigger scale in a way. But how can you get that balance when there are so many problems? I mean, you referred in your talk to the increased problems. And especially in relation, not only in terms of your agency, but also in terms of donors as well.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to get the balance right because, and I was very deliberate in the words that I chose. I said Syria is, at the top of my agenda, and yes, it's taking a huge amount of time. But I've recently been in Yemen. I've recently been in the Central African Republic, precisely because those are two countries in the world that. Most people, Central African Republic, most people they don't even know where it is. Central and African kind of, help a little bit, but it's not quite enough. A huge country geographically, 4.6 million people, every single one of them affected by the crisis in one way or the other, the entire population of the country. So I went there with the EU Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, Kristalina Georgieva, because we wanted to raise attention to it. And we have actually managed to do that. And we had a meeting in the margins of the General Assembly and everything else. So it is hard to get the balance right. And of course, the places where, your South Sudans, your Democratic Republic of the Congos, which year in, year out, you have to work in. And, people will come to me, I was in Sudan this year, but I have not been in South Sudan or Democratic Republic of the Congo this year. But I have been to Syria 5 times in the last 18 months. I have been to, Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey. I've been to Myanmar. You try to, I think the short answer is you just work harder and travel more.
And sorry, one connected thing which you raised was a very interesting point about how some countries, I think you mentioned Brazil, so it's not just the kind of classic old donor countries. How much is that really broadening out?
It is it is broadening out, not always in a consistent way, and I mean, and that's the other part of our work. So it's not just about these crises that suck all of the attention, and and one of the reasons that for John it was Sri Lanka, for me it's Syria. But one of the reasons you have to get it right is because if you don't get it right in the crises that are at the top of the public agenda, then people don't trust you to get it right in the other crises. So you have to. There's a political calculation there as well that you have to take on board. But I also mentioned the importance of sort of preparedness work. The sort of what I call newer agenda, which is about trying to reform the system, trying to look at what new ways of doing things, engaging in a really positive and constructive way with the new partners, Brazil, China, India, making sure that countries in the Asia-Pacific region, which on the whole suffer from natural disasters rather than conflict-related ones, don't feel left out. The same in Latin America and the Caribbean, that don't feel that, your entire workload is just about conflict and crisis. That is another balance that you're trying to manage the whole time.
Well, given the balancing act you've done, I'm really pleased that the balance managed to get you in London tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Really interesting on the challenges, stresses, and demands you face, and also for your candour, and particularly on Syria, but also more generally on what's faced by that. And so I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Valerie Amos for a fascinating evening. Thank you. And in our normal fashion, the drinks and other things outside. I look forward to welcoming you back to future events on similar themes.